Hello all. I was recently asked how easy is it to take data from Revit and bring it over to CET Designer. So I thought, hey, let's just make a quick tutorial on the different methods of how we can move Revit information, like a Revit typical or furniture or whatever, or chair. It could be any kind of a module or any kind of component that you drop in Revit and you want to bring it over into CET. Maybe you're using CET Designer. Maybe you've got someone else that's doing a layout in CET Designer, but you're a Revit person. So how do you get your Revit data to look good and render well inside of CET Designer? And that's exactly what we're going to look at. So here you can see this is CET Designer. I did a quick little render here. So I just go back to the standard viewport, orbit around a little bit. These models, this height adjustable table and this chair and the materials all came from Revit. Now I did change some of the materials. Once I brought it in, I thought, why not change the wood pattern on the surface, change the legs to black, do a different edge band, and played around with the brightness of the fabric itself. And so even though the materials come over initially from Revit, I was able to actually adjust them inside of CET. Because this particular workstation, maybe I'm replicating it 50 times over inside of CET Designer. And we have different fabrics for different workstation groups. So we want to have the full flexibility of being able to manipulate this inside of CET. Now the one catch is that the table and chair are going to come over together, so they'll stay together inside of CET. I won't be able to separate them. If I want to bring in this table and chair as individual objects from Revit and move them around independently, then I need to import them independently. So let's take a look at Revit. And here you can see I have a standard scene, very simplified. Got some walls, I got a window, a couple doors, and here's the table and the chair that I want to bring over into CET Designer. So the first thing when we go to bring this over is what are the different methods to bring this? A lot of people will say, well, you've got this DWG import. I bring Revit data, or you may be thinking to yourself, oh, I've brought Revit data over before by simply saving out the Revit scene as a DWG file and then using the DWG import within CET Designer. Pros and cons. Pro, it works, it's fast. The con, the materials are not going to come over. You're just going to get standard solid colored objects. They're not going to look all that pretty. They're not going to render very well. And adjusting the materials is going to be kind of frustrating. What I like to do is to use what's called the model lab inside of CET Designer to first bring the models from Revit over into the model lab. Once they're brought into the model lab, I can then manipulate them, and then I can then bring them into CET Designer. Now again, what are the exports from Revit? There's FBX, there's DWG, there's STL, all these different options. My favorite is to use the FBX transfer. The advantage of the FBX over the DWG is FBX will retain the bitmaps that you use. It will embed those bitmaps into the FBX file. So when we look at this chair, we've got a fairly exotic material, fabric attached to this chair. We got the wood grain on the actual work surface itself. And I want to preserve that. I don't want to have to recreate that material inside of CET Designer. Now I could, but why not bring it over and save myself some steps? If you use the DWG export from Revit, the DWG will not carry that information over. You're going to have to go find that bitmap or assign a new one. And on top of that, DWG files do not carry what we call mapping coordinate information over. And mapping coordinate information is really nothing more than telling an object how that bitmap or texture is to lay across that surface. Much like if I had this chair as a real chair and I wanted to apply real fabric to it, I have to decide with that pattern, does it go across the top of the chair? Is it horizontal? Is it vertical? What is the direction of how that material is going to be applied to that particular chair back? And same thing with the wood grain surface. What is the wood grain? How does it lay? What is the grain going vertically? In this case, it looks diagonal. What is that application? And when you use the DWG export option, none of that information is going to be preserved. So when you start inserting Revit components, especially those family tables that are coming from external vendors, they may have taken care to instruct the models how to map those coordinates. They may have used external tools to do advanced mapping, UVW mapping, in order to preserve that. And I'll actually show you a little bit later on when I get into a 3D Studio how it is a superior program when it comes to setting up your mapping coordinates. Really a totally separate tutorial on advanced mapping instructions, but I'll give you a little sneak peek later on in this video. All right. So I'm going to be using FBX. Again, DWG is okay, but the problem with DWG is no materials will come over, and it will make it a lot harder to assign materials in CET. What you'll find that will happen is if you bring this over as a DWG and you go to start applying materials, it's going to be much harder to separate out the edge band from the top and bottom surface, from the legs. You'll get a tendency of CET just applying the entire material to the entire object. So you'll be a little bit frustrated, and I'm not even going to bother showing it. I really want to focus on this FBX method and how sweet it is in order to use that to bring things over into CET Designer directly out of Revit. Okay, now first things first. When exporting an FBX file out of Revit, the thing you have to realize with Revit is when we do file export, it wants to export everything it can see in a 3D viewport. So there's two ways to isolate the table and chair from the wall. So I'm showing you this because you may be in a large project, and within this large project, someone's asking for just one small area, or some workstation, typical, some nursing station that you've put together, and you want to get it into CET Designer, but you don't want to have to deal with all the walls and windows and everything else that you've got in that particular scene. So how do I isolate? One method is to do what we call viewport clipping. Another tutorial that you can check out that's been created that will show you how to go into a Revit file that is multi-floors in 3D and how to crop to one small particular area. And when you crop to that area, when you export, it only will export what it can see. Now in this case, I've got a very small scene, and I'm not going to bother with the cropping. I'm just going to isolate these two objects and then do the FBX export. So let's go ahead and take a look here. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the first object, this chair, and I'll go ahead and pick the table. So I've got the two objects selected, and down here in Revit, and go down to the little glasses, what we call the isolation icon, and I'm going to say isolate these elements. So now everything else is gone. They're still there. You can see I'm in a temporary isolation mode. And so now I'm ready to do my FBX export, and I don't have to worry about windows and walls or any of the other components. Now again, table and chair will be linked together. They'll be sort of all together and forever. If I want them separate, I need to isolate them individually, but I'm going to leave these as a grouping. So here we go. Let's take a look at File, and we'll do an export, and I'm going to do FBX. And I want it to, oh, it's asking me about saving the project. I'm going to say, yeah, go ahead, save the project. That's fine. It's a little sample project that I created anyway. And let's go back to the FBX. Oh, it's over here on another screen. Let's bring it over. So here's my Revit FBX exporter. And you can see here that I've exported this once already before. So I'll just use the same name again. And the file type, FBX 215 and previous, it really doesn't matter which of these two. They're both going to be fine. So I'll just go with the bottom, this plain FBX, and hit save. Do we want to replace it? Yes. All right, since we are in an isolation mode, we're going to get another dialog box that says, hey, do you want to turn off the temporary isolation and export everything? Or do you want to leave the temporary isolation mode and just export what you can see? And that's what I'm after. I want to leave the temporary isolation mode on, and I want to export only what I can see. Okay, so these elements should have been exported out. I've got an FBX file, and that FBX file is going to contain everything. The models, the bitmaps are incorporated in the FBX. They're not saved out as separate little individual files. They're actually embedded in the FBX. And CET and other applications like SketchUp and Max, when you import FBXs into those programs, they, in their unencryption process, will unpack the 3D models and unpack the bitmaps and typically save them to wherever your scene is located. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn off the isolation mode, go ahead and just reset so that when I go back into my Revit scene, everything is back to normal. All right, now let's go ahead and jump into CET. And here's that existing scene. So what I'm going to do is just start a new scene from scratch. Save the current drawing, don't save. All right, so I've got a brand new CET scene, and I want to bring in the FBX. Now, in your typical import-export of your CET scene, you're going to see that there is no option to directly import FBX. The traditional import is looking only for DWG file. You can use this if you export DWG, but again, textures are gone. It's just going to be solid colors that were representative as the solid colors inside of Revit. In the Revit world, when a material is defined, you define it in two different ways. One, sort of a solid color representation, and then a material representation or realistic representation through what we call physical-based materials or PBRs. And so the FBX is going to say, hey, I will honor all that hard work that was done in Revit to set up this beautiful PBR material, bring out all that information. DWG ignores that, brings the objects and the object base colors only. So I can't use the standard import. So this is where the model lab comes in. So you can see here I've got my CET, all my icons, all my programs, and here we go. We've got the model lab, and let's go ahead and launch the model lab. And here's the previous scene. You can see when I was importing it earlier. So I'm just going to flush this out. So within the model lab, I'm just going to say remove all components. Let's just get rid of that. All right. And now I'm going to just do some things. I'm going to reset this back to normal. Let's just close it and reopen it one more time. There we go. Closing it and reopen it will wipe out all of the settings that I had in the model lab after I deleted the objects. I wanted to kind of reset the baseline here in the model lab and get it back to a starting point. Now, before we go into 3D Studio Max and look at why it has to be part of this equation of Revit to CET, let's see what happens if we take the FBX file, which I've been promoting to contain all of the information, mapping coordinates, the textures are integrated, they're all there. Let's see what CET does by taking the straight FBX out of Revit. So within the model lab, I'll do a file, I'll do an open, and here's my folder, and this is the FBX file. You can see I've got two. There's the one that was from Max. We'll recreate that too, but here's the one that we just did an export out of CET. So I'm just going to take this and bring it into the model lab, and it comes in, but sadly, no materials. Nothing is there, right? That's because the material types, the definition of those materials that Revit uses is what we call an Autodesk generic. It is an Autodesk product. So in most applications, they're not going to really understand what that is. Now, Max 3D Studio will understand that. It says, oh, hey, Revit, Max, we're all part of the same Autodesk family. And so those Revit materials convert into 3D Studio into this sort of Autodesk generic format. And then we convert that Autodesk generic format to just an old, what we call legacy standard format, which CET incorporates in very, very nicely. Hence, again, the need for 3D Studio to be part of this import equation. So I brought these in, have no materials on them. It does look like the objects are isolated individually, right, within the model lab. We do have in the model lab here, we do have a material editor. So we can kind of see, well, maybe if I don't have Max and I want to bring them over, can I recreate the materials inside the model lab? So one thing you don't want to do, whether you are in the model lab or whether you are actually in the CET interface, is don't grab a material here from the Material Explorer and just try to drag and drop it on. What it's going to do is attach to the entire chair, the entire table. You have to kind of do this little trick. This is the little CET isolate trick. Even though I'm picking this item here, you would think that if I drag a material, it would only assign to just the chair top. Let's see. Let's just grab this red. It looks like it only went to the chair top. All right, it's talking about, hey, I'm not sure if I support this. And let me just hit escape, click off of it, and it assigned to the entire chair. So I'm going to show you a little trick to get around that. So let me undo this. Let's do a little undo here, a little Control Z. Find my control button. Another one. There we go. Let's get it back to normal. All right. All right. All right. And one more. And now let's go into the Material Explorer. And I'm going to do what's called a pick. And I'm going to pick from this surface. And it's showing me what was red. Oops, things are zooming around a little bit. Go back, do another pick from here. All right, I'm just going to close this. I'm not going to edit it. And now that I've picked that, I'm going to go back to the Material Lab and see what happens if I just drag to just here. And click off, hit escape for the material application, click off, still black. See, I'm still having problems getting these things separated. You know, even this trick that typically works doesn't seem to be working. It just is really just being super finicky. And that's the problem with the DWG and the fact that Revit doesn't have layers. So now what we have is a single DWG coming in with no layers at all. Everything goes on one layer in CET, and the material definition, it's just all over the place, and it's very, very difficult. So if you're going to bring something over, and I'll just clear this out and flush it, I'll just do remove everything from the model lab, go and just re-import it one more time, which is an open. All right, if you're going to bring this over and you don't really care about the materials, you would think, and I'm not quite done with this yet before we go to 3D Studio Max, you would think that, hey, I can go ahead and just say, I don't care about materials, Roy. I just want to see the objects inside of my CET Designer scene. It's okay if they come in just, flat out gray. Now, here's the weird thing about the units. Now, my Revit scene was based on inches. Everything was done with imperial inches, so the scale of everything there was known as 5 means 5 inches, so the unit base was an inch. And my CET Designer scene is exactly the same way. It is not a metric-based scene, it is an English-based scene. But let's take a look. Let's see what the scale is. Let's see when the FBX imports into the Model Lab, is the scale honored. So I'm going to kind of do a little split screen here. I'm going to slide this over and sort of shrink it down a little bit because I want to see both this and close the Material Explorer. I don't need that. And first thing I'm going to do is just put a regular chair inside of this scene. So I'll just grab a Herman Miller chair. The Cellar chair is fine. Let's just drop this thing right on in here. All right. And I'm doing this so that I've got some reference of scale and size. Now I'm going to take from the Model Lab and drag this scene that was in the Model Lab into the CET Designer scene where the rest of my architecture and the rest of all of my elements exist. So you can see here in the Model Lab, I'm going to take this file. It says drop files here, as if you're bringing them in, but I'm just going to drag this over, kind of go the other way, and holy moly, when I put this thing in here, it is absolutely giant. And the problem is that even though Revit is telling the FBX file that the base value of scale is 1 unit inch represents 1 unit represents an inch, CET is going, I think you meant that was in centimeters. So here is a trick. If you're going directly from Revit to FBX, directly to CET, you've got to go into the Model Lab scale and set it to 0.254. Basically, we've got to say there is a scale conversion that is going to represent this thing in a centimeter base. So now let's drag this over. And that is looking correct. And so let's just escape. Let's zoom in. And now you can see that the base unit should be correct with this by using the 0.254. Right? That is a small desk, but that is correct. Everything is scaled proportionally, right? It's not a random number. It is 0.254 for this. All right. Now, CET to FBX, Revit to FBX, FBX directly into the Model Lab, set the scale to 0.254, drag it in, you're good to go. Don't have to worry about the materials if you don't want to. You can just go on with your scene and we can be done. But the whole topic of this was to bring in the Revit models into CET with the materials coming over with them. So I'm going to just blow out this file from the Model Lab. Let's just remove everything from the Model Lab. And I'll go ahead and just close it for now. And I'll just delete this item and I'll just leave the chair there. It's fine. Maybe move it over a little bit. Well, CET, it's recentering on the floor. it says, no, it doesn't matter where you move it. I'm going to recenter the floor. Once I bring in the desk, the floor automatically expands. So, all right, now let's look at my preferred method of going from Revit to CET. So we don't have to do anything in Revit. We still have the FBX. So we're done with Revit. So I'll just minimize that. But now I'm going to go into 3D Studio. And when I open up 3D Studio, you're going to see not an empty scene, but a teapot. Because what I want to do is to kind of talk about why 3D Studio is probably the best transposing sort of middleware software to have in this conversion process, because it has one of the best mapping structures and material structures of all of the applications. Maya's pretty good too. If you're a Maya user, you could probably do the same thing. I've tried this through Adobe Dimension, which is another application that comes with the Adobe Creative Cloud Suite. Doesn't understand the Revit generic Autodesk material, so you'd have to recreate your materials inside of Dimension. Then you could take Dimension and do an FBX into the Model Lab, and you'd get the materials. But again, I'm trying to do this as easy as possible. And Adobe Dimension, much like the CET Model Lab, doesn't really have a whole lot going for it when it comes to mapping coordinates. So let's just take a quick look at that. And this isn't a mapping coordinate tutorial, but here you can see I've got a teapot, and on this teapot I have applied a bitmap from one of my favorite animations, Surf's Up. I love this movie, so I just decided to take a bitmap, which represents a magazine cover, animation magazine, and just apply it to this teapot. And now let's talk about what mapping coordinates are, just in a little bit more detail without going too crazy. All right, first, let me show you the material. So this is the material that I made here, and here's the bitmap. We just take a quick look at the bitmap. So this is the bitmap that I want to lay around that teapot. Now, a lot of 3D applications don't have advanced mapping coordinates. CET Designer, for instance, in the Model Lab, you're going to see it has fairly rudimentary mapping coordinate methodologies. Adobe Dimension is almost the same. It doesn't really give you a lot of choices on how to tell the mesh how to wrap that image around that teapot. And I'll show you that with 3D Studio and how advanced it can be. It's crazy how good this thing is when it comes to really making those bitmaps wrap perfectly around that model. And if you play a lot of video games, if you're into that, almost every video game that's produced today, 3D Studio Max or Maya is in the mix. The models, the materials, the mapping coordinates are all set up in 3D Studio, then brought into the game design platform that the company happens to be using. All right, so this is the bitmap. It's assigned to this material that is on the teapot, just a basic white material that's going to use the bitmap. And if I look at this particular mesh, I'm going to turn this off, for instance, and go to what we call standard UVW mapping. So most programs like this modifier that you see here in Max have very, very simple mapping features. Do you want this to be a plane, which is, you can see this sort of icon here, this sort of orange square. It's basically projecting the image straight down. Do you want this to wrap around like a cylinder? Do you want this to be spherically mapped? Box, do you want it to come from like 6 different directions, basically sort of do box mapping? Every polygon face gets the map. All these different options are there. I'm going to go back to what I had cylindrical. And if I was to go into CET real quick and fire back off that Model Lab, you're going to see that it has some of the same features in that basic mapping coordinate. Even without bringing a model in, I can come down here into what we call advanced UV control. And you can see that it's fairly basic. Box mapping, planar mapping, cylindrical mapping, spherical mapping, and you can adjust the scale or offset or rotation, but that's really about it. So with such a very limited construct of UV mapping information, I wouldn't want to necessarily use CET's model maker in order to do UVW mapping. So let's go back into 3D Studio. I've got it down here somewhere. Here we go. And I'm going to launch what's called this Unwrap UVW. And just to show you what game designers do all the time, and what I do a lot when I've got an object that I want to use a bitmap to map to that and to really get it right where I want it to be, right to the edges, and have perfect, form, wrap and weave and direction and grain direction and all that be exactly where I want it to be. I'm going to launch what's called the UV editor just so you can see. And in this UV editor, what I can do is that mesh is actually unwrapped like a flat pattern. And now that I can see the structure of that mesh unwrapped as a flat pattern, and there's different ways to unwrap it. I'm not going to go into the details of how we can unwrap meshes. There's a whole lot of different methodologies. This is just a basic unwrap. So down here at the bottom is the body of the teapot. Up here is the top. Here we have the handle, and here we have the spout. And what I did was I decided, hey, I want to take this handle and I want it to use a particular region of this bitmap. Now I'm going to shrink this up a little bit because you'll see there's going to be interaction between what I do here and what I can see over within 3D Studio. So I can decide, what I want anywhere within this, where that handle is supposed to be. And I can stretch this mesh around, move all the points, all kind of things. Same thing with the spout over here. If we glide over here, say I could have this spout say, no, I only want it to use just this little blue area. I don't want it to use anything else. Or, I want it to use the word surf. I can just come over here to surf, drag this over, do some rotation, some scaling. Whatever I want to do, because again, this is a very advanced, way of dealing with these meshes, and I can have this thing go in. And this is what I would call the most basic way I can get into really manipulating this. But let me go ahead and just close it and turn this thing off. Now you can see that it's been mapped in a more advanced style. So I've got a better lay of this map across the object. So this is why I love 3D Studio. It has advanced mapping and material applications that the Model Lab will incorporate. So all this advanced mapping that's been done inside of 3D Studio will transpose over automatically. And those UVW coordinates, as they're called, are baked into the geometry. So when CET incorporates this model, you don't have to worry about doing any UVW mapping inside of CET. It's already there. It's been done prior to it. All right. Now, of course, let's get back to where we wanted to be here. We were talking about, hey, it's already been done in Revit. I don't know how to do all that advanced UVW stuff. So do I ignore all of that and simply bring the Revit scene into this 3D Studio application and then just bop it straight over? Do I have to go through all this? And the answer is no, we don't have to go through all this. I just did this as a pitch to say this is one of the reasons why 3D Studio is a great application to put in the mix when you're really trying to set up good looking meshes that are going to be coming inside of CET Designer, and materials too, to start. All right, so let me just reset this application. And if you want to know more about all of this, there'll be more tutorials in the future, and there's plenty on YouTube that go through advanced mapping within 3D Studio Max. I could make them, but there's probably 500 of them in YouTube of people going through all kind of various things that you can do. Most of them are centered around game design, but you can transfer that over to, say, furniture too. So brand new scene. Let's go ahead and import in the FBX file. Okay. Again, I got two FBX files. This is the export file. This is the earlier sample I did when validating this tutorial would work. So I'm just going to go and bring in here. This is the FBX straight out of Revit, right? Revit file, isolate, export, FBX. Now I open up Max, find that FBX straight out of Revit, and let's just do an open. And I'm not going to go through all of the options. You can basically just use the Autodesk Architectural Revit option if you want. It's all going to be the same thing. Might as well just go ahead and pick it. Just hit OK. All right. Don't worry about the warnings here. This is just talking about there are things that, like cameras and things like that, that it's not too keen on, and you can see it's brought it in here. So typically what I do when I would do my imports, I'm just going to do another reset, is I turn off of those features because I'm like, I don't want to have to go find these things. If you're a big Max user, that can be kind of annoying. So I'm just going to do an import again. Let's just go back in here. Going to jump off of that, and well, I'm going to do a custom, what we call media and entertainment, and I'm going to pick exactly those items that I want. Smoothing groups, yeah, bring those over. And nope, there's no animation. Nope, I don't want the cameras. Nope, I don't need any of the lights. I'm just trying to get geometry. There is no audio. Let's take a look at advanced options, units, automatic. That means everything will go in inches. UI interface. Yeah, the warning manager. So I've turned off a lot of those things that came in, and you can see that's why it says user defined. So now I'll go ahead and do an OK. There we go. That's better. So I don't have all that Revit camera and lights and other clutter trying to really get in the mix. So here you can see, here's the models, right? They're brought in, and bam, the materials are exactly the same that they were in Revit. Let me kind of zoom in here. There is the fancy fabric in Revit. We have the base, which is some kind of black material, and we have the wood grain surface for the top. Looks like the edge is sort of a plain color. Don't really see any wood grain, and we have sort of the ivory colored legs there. I don't know what the materials were inside of Revit. I can change them later on inside of CET. I don't want to get into a lot of advanced material changing inside of Autodesk 3D Studio Max. Now, we've got all of this, so someone would say, oh great, do a file export, get that FBX going. Well, hold on, time out, because let's talk about those materials. And here you can see in this material editor that 3D Studio Max has, here are the materials that are part of all of those objects. And this is where I was talking about the Autodesk sort of generic style material. So here you can even see the label, Autodesk generic. We have Autodesk plastic. So Autodesk themselves, they decided that they would create their own kind of material that's unique to just Autodesk products. So if I take an FBX out of 3D Studio right now, I'll get a warning that says these materials are incompatible with FBX. Doesn't even understand what is an Autodesk material. It'll honor them, but if I bring this into to the model lab right now, it'll be gray and it'll say, I don't know what these materials are. Autodesk materials. I'm CET. I don't know what that means. It understands plain generic, what we call standard, right, or physical-based materials, but it doesn't understand anything of the Autodesk, nature. So what I've got to do is convert these materials over from this Autodesk material format into something in 3D Studio, which is called the old standard, the old legacy standard, because CET is super friendly when it comes to understanding these standard materials. Now, all right, let's take a look. So there are a couple of different ways we can change these materials inside of 3D Studio Max to this so-called standard. If you are a 3D Studio Max user, these are going to be very familiar. There's sort of a manual way if you want to kind of, really massage the materials, or there is some simple automation through script. The manual way would basically mean I'd have to, the bitmap is fine. Actually, it's not fine either. It's using what we call the Autodesk bitmap shader. That's not going to be good either. And so you really would have to just totally recreate all of the materials from scratch as a standard material. So I could go in here, go scan line, we call the old standard legacy. Don't use anything else. This works great. And then I could, now go get a bitmap, and then I got to go find that. It's too much trouble. I just want automation. But feel free, if you're a Max user and you like making materials, to remake each of these manually. I want to do automation. That's the way to go. So I'm just going to purge this out. So here, you look at the scene materials, and I'm going to leave this open, and you can see they are right now what we call Autodesk Metallic. Now, there are a couple scripts that you can find on Script Spot that you can use and download. Some are free, one cost, in order to do what we call a batch conversion from one material type to another. Now, this one here called Arch Standard Script gets you about halfway. It will convert the generic material to a scanline material. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't take the what we call bitmap, generic Autodesk bitmap, and convert that into what we call the standard bitmap. So you'd still have to do some manual work. So it's not quite there. It's a great script, and I've used it many times before if I'm staying inside of 3D Studio Max. But since I'm moving from Max into CET Designer, I need full conversion, and this only really gets me halfway. So I'm not even going to run it. I have another script that I have downloaded from ScriptSpot, which is part of the V-Ray family. So yes, we use the V-Ray rendering engine. Of course, it's a great rendering engine inside of 3D Studio. I'm not doing anything inside of V-Ray. I just need this script in order to do this sort of a two-step conversion process, because this V-Ray material conversion script is pretty powerful. It'll take all of these materials and convert to a V-Ray material, which the advantage is all the properties of these materials are going to be honored. So if I was to look at, say, this plastic laminate as a material, it has a certain amount of glossiness. You can see it here on this sphere. There are certain bitmaps that are, driving, the bumpiness and the pattern and all of the rest. The same thing with the wood. And so, that wood image is just part of it, but how glossy is it? How shiny is it? Does it have a rough texture surface? And so whereas the Arch to Standard script would honor some of that, it wouldn't honor all of it. This V-Ray material script will pick up all of those attributes of those generic materials. But it's kind of strange. I've got to go from this Autodesk generic to V-Ray, but then I'll use the same script to go from V-Ray back to standard. So I'm going to go to the first side of the conversion. All supported materials go to V-Ray materials. And I've checked pretty much everything that's available to me. And I'll just do a convert. Now, if you watch in the video, you're going to see all of these change in real time. So I'll hit convert. Do you really want to do this? Yes. Okay. And bam, you can see it just changed over here. Everything has been converted to V-Ray materials. Now, V-Ray materials and CET Designer, they're not going to understand each other. So I'm going to run the second half of this script. It's to say, now let's take all the V-Ray materials and convert them into the old standard legacy materials, and hit convert again. And you're going to see all of this now change from V-Ray to standard legacy. And bam, now I've got standard legacy. And the bitmaps are old standard bitmaps. So if I was to bring in this seat fabric as an example, let's take a look at it. I can see that it's the old standard bitmap for you, a Max user, and this is an old standard legacy material. And CET Designer will say, I will totally honor this, not a problem when you make that FBX file. If you use the other script, the Arch Standard, when you export the FBX, don't be surprised if you get some error messages. CET is going to kind of say, I half like what you're doing. So, real quick recap. I did an FBX import into 3D Studio Max from Revit. I went in, and you don't have to open the material editor, but the recap is you bring in the FBX, you use this V-Ray converter script, convert whatever materials came in to V-Ray, and then V-Ray to standard. You don't even have to look at the material editor if you don't even want to. You don't even have to open that thing. All right, so I'm ready to export this thing out. That's all I got to do. And so now I'm going to do a file. I'm going to do an export. And I'm going to call this the From Max file. All right, so From Max FBX. Do you want to replace it? Sure, let's just replace it. And this, of course, in the FBX exporter, there are a lot of things like, do you want to include animation? My basic settings are, I want the smoothing groups. I want, however smooth and whatever curvature that's defined within what we call procedural render smoothing, honor the render smoothing, and just the basic settings here. There's no cameras, no lights, so I don't even check them. I just basically go with, these are my options here if you want to take a look at them. Turbo smooth, convert, deforming, preserve edge, orientation, all of that great stuff. No cameras, no lights. The units Are inches? I could still say automatic. I just happened to just manually set it to inches. Max uses what's called Z up, and that is the default, is Z up, and show the warning. So let's go ahead and just hit OK. All right, so it's basically saying there's probably one texture incompatibility, map number 8. So I'll go take a look at that and see. It's probably something that Max interpolated as procedural. Procedural. Oh, that's a hard word to say. Say that 10 times. Procedural. All right, so let's take a look at it. Made the file. It's just a warning. Let's just quickly look at what map number 8 was. And map number 8 right here was part of this metal. And so for you Max users, oh yeah, it's what we call a bump map. Bump map makes a flat, smooth texture render with dimples, right? Like it's really texturally, got dimples. Even though the mesh is flat and smooth, we can make it look like it's fuzzy, if you want to call it fuzzy, or bumpy like a lunar surface. So we call bump mapping. And this particular bump map is not using bitmaps. This is actually what we call a procedural. It's using algorithms to determine bump. And FBX doesn't understand it. Everything needs to be defined with bitmap. So if I want to have bump on this metal, what I need to do is to throw this away and create a regular bitmap, find a bitmap that has actual texture to it, and then use that. So this is not that kind of tutorial, so I'm just going to just eliminate that for now. If you want to know more about that, there are plenty of other tutorials on how to create bumpy textures inside of 3D Studio Max. I'm sure you can YouTube it. So I've got the FBX. I'm going to ignore the fact that that bump is not going to come over, and it's supposed to be metal anyway, so I don't need it to be bumpy. I want it to be smooth. All right, so now we're ready to bring inside of CET Designer. So let's jump back into CET, and got the model lab here. If you closed it, remember it's right here. Here's your model lab. Click on the model lab button. I'll go ahead and expand it for now, and we're just going to import that from Max FBX. And when we import this, bam, you can see there it is. The materials came in with it. Now, if you want to reassign materials in here, you can do that. I'm actually going to do material reassignment not within the model lab because I don't want to change the base materials of the root objects. I'm actually going to change the materials within the CET Designer interface. And the reason for that is I might be populating this. 6 of the desks may want to be just like this. 6 more may want to use a red fabric on the chair and mahogany or something. So I'm actually going to show all material adjustments within the CET Designer interface itself. If you do want to adjust the materials, you can do them right here within the model lab. You can interact with the material lab itself, the material explorer, and you can make your changes here. But it's the process of when I show those changes inside the CET Designer interface would be the same process you'll do here. And quick note, there's a real trick. You really got to see this when I get into that. Even if you're not doing any of this conversion, and if you ever are really frustrated with CET assigning a material to the entire object and just not a part of it, and you're frustrated with that, you might get a clue on what's happening and a workaround that I've got to do that. So I'll show that in a minute. Once we bring this into the CET Designer interface, I'll do the materials and the trick that goes along with it. So you would think, oh, we're ready. Let's just drag and drop this thing in. And hold on, time out. Earlier, when I brought the Revit FBX in, which was inch base, directly into the model lab, I had to do a centimeter conversion. You saw me earlier in the video go in here and put in 0.254 to change the base scale. Well, when Max makes the FBX, it incorporates the units too, and it did tell the scene that the base unit 1 represents an inch. Well, what happens is CET and the incorporation of this FBX is not quite picking up on what Max is telling it. If you look at these units, you can see, whoa, 2,362 units wide? Inches wide? That's what? That's massive. If I drag this into CET, the chair is going to be like an ant's chair and not like a doll's chair. So what's going on? I don't know. I mean, this is a good question for the configurer guys. Why is the model lab not picking up on that? But you're going, oh my gosh, how do I fix it? Not a problem. what CET is picking up on is the base unit is millimeters. So I'm going to go into the scale and put in 0.0254 and adjust it. Now you can see that looks better. That's probably a 60-inch wide table, hence the 60 inches. Of course, the depth is the table plus the chair, so it's going to be an odd number, and the height of that chair is roughly around 35 inches. So if it's an FBX from Revit to Model Lab, 0.254. If it's an FBX from 3D Studio into the Model Lab, 0.0254, a millimeter conversion. So now I've got the scale conversion right. I'm ready to drag this thing in. And we'll just place it here, and we'll hit escape, and I'm done with the Model Lab. I can go ahead and close it, and bam, there we go. We've got it in here. But last thing that I want to show you is maybe you want to make some material adjustments because you may be populating this in different areas. I'll just do it to the one. I'm not going to bother cloning or making grouping, but this is one single object, and I don't need this chair anymore. I had the Sella chair in there really just so that I could understand, the scale, and we looked at that much earlier when we were discovering that metric to English conversion. All right, so here is the thing, and you're going to see me do some undos. I want to say change the surface of the wood from the, oh, and by the way, the FBX that came over from 3D Studio, all it was just an FBX. So if you're not a Max person, if say you're a CET Designer person or a Revit person and you want to give a coworker something to use in CET, and you say, well, I can't do that, 3D Studio side. We got a lot of 3D Studio artists in the Herman Miller domain here. Simply hook up with someone, send them your FBX from Revit. They can incorporate that into Max, do those changes for you, and then they'll return to you an FBX. So you give them an FBX, they'll give you one back. Then you can give your CET person the FBX that they made, and maybe show them this video on how to do the incorporation using the Model Lab. All right, so let's change that wood surface, and I'm going to show you the why to do that at the moment, and then here's how you can get around that. Okay, so I'm going to go into the Material Explorer, and I want to go into woods. Let's find some nice woods here. And I've got some really nice sort of cherry woods down here that I want to apply to the surface. So can I just drag and drop? Let's just see, drum roll, grab it. Oh, it changed the entire thing. I didn't even have it selected, and it did the whole thing. What? So this is the crazy thing. It's one object, and it's almost impossible to just go to the Explorer. And most normal CET objects, when you drag and drop them in, you literally can just go drag, drop. And for you CET users, if it's an object that has multiple elements, it'll bring up a little dialog box and say, oh, you're dragging to this chair. What part of the chair do you want to put this to? The arms, the base, the back, the casters, depending on how that model was separated into individual elements within CET Designer. It's really, really smart. It just didn't throw it to the whole thing. But this is not a native, highly curated CET model. It's just something we brought over from Revit. So the drag and drop, it looks like it's broken. It's going to apply to everything. But here's the workaround. Here we go. We can trick the system. So what I'm going to do is within the Material Explorer, I'm going to do a pick. And I'm going to pick. Now I can say, oh, it's showing me individual elements and even telling me there's that material dialog box. So I'm going to grab the top surface here. And here is that surface. It brought it in. Now I can make changes if I want. I can adjust it. But I don't want to do anything. I just want to replace it. But here's that trick. So I did the pick to let it pick it. I'm just going to close the lab. Let's minimize it, kill it. Now I'm going to grab and just click the cherry, and it only did the top. Crazy. If I do a pick first and then pick that element, CET is sort of holding on to that element. It's saying, oh, that's the object you're trying to manipulate. And then when you go to the Explorer, it only assigns to that element. So I want to do the edge band. I want to get this sort of a walnut edge band on here. So again, I'm going to do a pick, grab the edge, I can even see it up there in the green dialog box. All right, it's going to say this is the edge. It's the gross, so I don't want to change it. I could adjust it. I'm not. I'm just going to hit close. And now there's a walnut, right? Perfect. And let's say the legs of the table, maybe we want more of a smoky metal, not that sort of gross sort of beige that came over from Revit. On this particular table, maybe other tables in the scene, they want to keep that. So again, pick the legs, close this, I'm not changing it. Go to metals. And here we go, right here. Now we got the metals change. Maybe this one. I like that one better. All right, and let's change the base of the chair to a shinier black. Those casters are part of the base, so they're going to go with it. I'm not changing this material. And this one will go with, I guess, cast iron. Why not? And lastly, the chair fabric, I'd like to put a little bit more sheet gloss on it. Maybe this is a vinyl fabric, and a vinyl fabric, not just cloth fabric. So let's do one more pick the chair back. And in this case, I am going to stay in the material lab, and we're going to open up specular and we'll make some tweaks. Yeah, looks great, and I can make more changes. I think I'm fine. Close it, and there we go. I'm done with the Material Explorer, and there we have it. Let's hit the render. Now I should be ending where I began, and if we let it render here, we should see we took a model from Revit, and the materials that were in Revit, we incorporated them into CET Designer. It's an object, it's to scale. I can adjust the materials, I can honor the materials, I can render, and I can now have a method of saying, hey, I can collaborate with a Revit designer that can do, you can bring walls in this way if you want. A lot of people bring walls in through DWG export out of Revit. Hey, try the FBX method. But if it's like if you're doing workstation typicals, and you want to lay them out in Revit, especially I know healthcare uses Revit a lot, but you want to do more things in CET, you're collaborating, stay in Revit, go through this method, hand that FBX off to your CET person, give them the instructions, tell them to watch the video on how to do the import through the model lab, and your project will look great. And so I'm hoping that this video made sense. I know 3D Studio is in the mix, and if you don't know it or don't have it, just reach out to the artists that we have at Herman Miller that use 3D Studio Max. You can contact me, and I'll put you in touch with someone who can do that 3D Studio conversion. It's a really simple process. You saw that when I did it. It doesn't take like hours or days. It literally takes minutes to simply import your file, run a script, and export your file. So it's that easy. Then when you hand the FBX off to the CET designer, they can then do the rest of the process of adjusting the materials or just keep the materials as is. So I'm hoping that you saw this. I hope that you like it and you see the power of a new method of how you can go from Revit to CET. So if you have any questions, just shoot me an email or give me a buzz. Talk to you later.